Okay, we're good to go.
All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to both our in-person audience as well as our online and virtual audience. Cannon Beach Library is thrilled to have Craig here with us today
Honored to be
as
here.
part of our Northwest Author Series. So it's very exciting that he's able to be here with us today. We want to thank the Inn at Cannon Beach for helping to sponsor the event, and also the Cannon Beach Book Company for promoting our event and being here with books for sale after the presentation. So we're here with Greg to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the publication of his award-winning graphic novel Blankets. If you haven't read it yet, you are in for a treat.
I'm checking my phone to make sure my ringer's off.
It is. Good. So today you'll hear about Craig's writing and drawing process, as well as the impact Blankets had on his professional life, his writing career, his family, and readers. Craig is well known and deeply respected in the graphic arts world and has been honored by its most prestigious entities. For Blankets alone, he received 3 Harvey Awards, and that's actually in honor of and named for Harvey Kurtzman from Mad Magazine. And for Blankets, he won for Best Artist, Best Graphic Album of Original Work, and Best Cartoonist, and 2 Eisner Awards for Best Graphic Album and Best Writer Artist. His other books include Goodbye Chunky Rice, Habibi, I know a favorite from one of our audience members here, and Carnet du Voyage, Space Dumplings, and Ginseng Roots, which is a serialized format I hope Craig will tell us a little bit about.
I will. Yeah.
I'll let you in on a very big secret. Graphic novels are not necessarily funny. Sometimes, as in any novel, there may be humor, but the themes are often quite serious, as they are in Blankets. Craig's characters struggle with family crisis, the unraveling of a religious upbringing, a first love, the huge responsibilities that young people have, and an overall longing for connection and security. Blankets is a universal story of human potential and longing. Translated into how many languages?
Around 20.
A bunch.
Yeah.
20 languages, which is just amazing. I read the funny papers as a child. Do you remember that term? Funny papers. Introduced to them by my grandpa in the Columbus, Ohio Sunday Dispatch. But one of the first graphic novels that I read as an adult was The Arrival by Sean Tan.
Excellent.
It was wordless and told a beautiful story of dislocation and loneliness and finally connection for a man in a new world. And I don't think that particular story could have been told in any way better than in the graphic form. There is a graphic novel out there for everyone. And if you haven't read one, start with Blankets. You'll have an opportunity. We have them right here. And you can even borrow my copy, but first buy your own. You'll be hooked. So let's get started and give Craig a big welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Do you prefer I stand or sit? What's going to be best for?
You get to choose.
All right.
You are most all above. Just mix it up.
Okay, yeah, I'll mix it up. If I get tired, I'll sit, but I want to make sure I can see everyone. Thank you, Pam,
You're
for
welcome.
that intro. Did you write that yourself?
Of course.
That's a really good intro. Yeah. Can you even write my Wikipedia page? And of course, thank you, Cannon Beach Library, Cannon Beach Books, and the Cannon Beach Inn. So, and everyone that's here today on a Saturday when you could be out at the beach. Really honored to be here. I've been an Oregonian, as Pam was saying, for 26 years now, living in Portland since 1997. This is my first time doing this presentation.
Oh, good.
I actually got it, I got it together like a month or 2 ago. But then I was at Powell's and I just did kind of more of a mediated sort of interview on stage rather than my presentation. And I was saying that I was going to use this presentation in Europe. I just canceled that tour. So this is the first and maybe, who knows, only presentation, at least for a while. So again, happy to be here.
Thank you.
And I got a whole bunch of images. Hopefully we can get through them in an hour, do some Q&A, do a signing. And this is just a quick example of some of like the cover art, how it goes from the inks and the pencils going backwards. And the 6 books you were mentioning, Blankets is really my sophomore effort 20 years ago now. So, hey, thanks for making it. Oh, we're still getting people. And so the book came out 20 years ago with a Oregon-based publisher, a very small publisher at the time, just one guy who was a bartender at an Italian restaurant. and just out of his basement, he was publishing comics when I first moved here. And this was 20 years ago. We had like basically a handshake agreement. I'll talk more about that process in a moment. But the original edition was 20 years ago with Top Shelf. And then since 2011, it's been with Drawn and Quarterly. That's a Montreal-based publisher, bigger publisher. And this is a previous version of the cover. I'm obsessive, so I drew the trees a couple of times, probably 3 times before I kept the ones for the cover. And there's the pencils. And everything in Blankets, but maybe my newest project too, goes back to my relationship with my brother. This is from the back cover of the new edition, and there's a photo of my little brother and I. He's 3 years younger than me, and we grew up in a like a very rural, working class family. And I think my attachment to the comics medium relates to that sort of working class upbringing, but also kind of religious upbringing. I think they're related. You mentioned the funnies, and I grew up in this working class family. We didn't really have access to the arts other than that full color funny section that came with the Sunday paper on the weekend. And we had that before we had TV. So this was the visual medium that imprinted on me. It wasn't painting. It wasn't, it's funny I've stuck with it this long, So yeah, my brother and I, we'd get this like 1980s computer paper from our neighbor who was a mile away. We were living in the country. And we just draw these elaborate scrolls. It's hard to see because it's just pencil on this old withered paper. This is like a snowscape, though, if you could see it closer. There's like snowball fights and snowmobiles. And there's a little close-up of the kind of stuff we would draw. And we also would make comic books. So we just used that computer paper, and our mom would put contact paper on the covers and to make a faux laminate. So on one side there'd be our comics, and then on the other side it's like 1980s computer data printout, probably people's credit card numbers and stuff like that. And then this is like high school. So like all throughout childhood I was obsessed with comics, and then high school hits and I kind of like just fell out of love with comics. I was more interested in girls and skateboarding. But I was still drawing, and this is the skate ramp in our backyard that kind of gives you an example of the rural environment out there, as does the tractor sign, and the cow udder shirt that I'm wearing. But yeah, so like through high school, I wasn't looking at comics other than maybe Calvin and Hobbes in the paper. I was obsessed with Calvin and Hobbes, but I really was interested in a career in animation. Until I finished high school, and then I became very disillusioned with that dream because I was just a working class kid that didn't feel like I had any prospects of getting into university, and then even if I could get into an art school, I was like, I'll just be a cog in the machine of the animation industry. Like I'll be the guy who's animating snowflakes and Frozen, and like I wanted to do it all. I wanted to write the stories, I wanted to design characters and do the backgrounds. And that's when I rediscovered the comics medium. So this is like mid 90s. And in the mid 90s, there was this mini comic movement going on, which corresponded to the zine movement, which is also an extension of just kind of DIY punk rock culture, grunge culture of the 90s, where people were making homemade cassette tapes and homemade zines and photocopying together. When I moved to Portland, Oregon in 1997, there was Reading Frenzy books that used to be by Powell's, and they specialized in zines. And zines are also like homemade media that predates the internet. Like people were just going to Kinko's and stapling together their own little photocopied books. And some of the great zine writers, like Dishwasher Pete. He was a big celebrity in the 90s. He lived in Portland. There was a whole Riot Girl movement that was based in the whole Pacific Northwest, and zines were really attached to that movement. But I started making my own homemade mini comics. So this is kind of like the output that I did in those years while working crappy jobs. And when I moved to Portland, I had started on a new mini comic that was really kind of a love letter to my friends in Wisconsin. Half of the stories were very personal stories about friends, kind of autobio memoir stories. Can you see over here?
Yeah, I'm doing.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can lean back a little.
It's so comfortable.
This will be, yeah. Hey, thanks for making it. And then, so on the left, I was also doing these stories of this little cute little chunky rice turtle. And so when I met this Portland publisher that was just this kind of homemade, working out of his basement publisher, he saw what I was working on. He's like, your personal stories are a little too personal. They're like, maybe just for your friends. But he's like, I really like this little cartoon turtle. And if you did a whole book of that, I would publish it. And so I took some of the pages from the mini comic and kind of transformed my personal stories into this cartoon characters. I kind of real life people evolved into cartoons in that book. And I redrew a lot of the pages. On the left is like the mini comic version. On the right was the published book version. But basically the main character, this little turtle, was me. And yeah, so that came out in 1999. That was my first book. I was working a bunch of terrible jobs, but then my last real job was at Dark Horse Comics, which is in Milwaukee, Oregon, Portland. I was a graphic designer there. So longest I've ever been able to hold a real job. I was there for 7 months. So, and it was both my best and worst job ever, because like I was the best because I was working in comics, which was my dream, but it was the worst because I wasn't actually making comics. I was just designing logos and lunch boxes, and some of the projects I was into, and some I was just like, but I was also started doing graphic design for the small company Top Shelf. And I would go there once a week. I didn't have a computer of my own. I'd go to his house and work on their computer, do the book design. And that's where I discovered my publisher's international collection of graphic novels in this new wave of French cartoonists. And these two creators and these two books are probably the biggest influence I could track on blankets. Both of these were published in 1998. One is Bletch, one is Baudouin. I'll show you how much I ripped off these creators. So Edmond Baudouin's book, Pierrot, is a lot about growing up with his little brother and sharing a bed. I think they even might have been 3 years apart too. So I'm sure I absorbed that image and it kind of got recycled into blankets. Here's more of the scenes of them drawing together as kids. And then Bletch's book, Le Petit Christian, is about himself as a little kid. Here's a scene on the top of him exploring his grandmother's bedroom and seeing these Jesus iconography. And it kind of mirrors what I did in blankets with the Jesus portrait in my parents' room. And here's one more scene. Christian's dad is telling his little brother to eat his meat, which is exactly what my dad is doing when I was a high school vegetarian. So both of those books were slim volumes, though. They're both around 100 pages or so. Blankets, of course, is closer to 600 pages. And the inspiration for that format came from another French book, Lapignon, which was this cartoonist who claims he didn't know how to draw. So he challenged himself to draw 500 pages. And he's like, either I'll learn to draw or I'll get it on my system and I'll move on to a different career. And in fact, he learned how to draw and he created a whole career for himself. So I challenge myself to the same exercise. Let's draw 500 pages and see what happens. My books always start in sketchbooks. That's probably my favorite part of the process of making graphic novels. It's the most organic. It's the most similar to childhood, where you're just kind of dreaming things up on paper. On the left was the first blanket sketchbook, which was a month or two after moving to Portland at the end of 97. But then, of course, I went and focused on that Goodbye Chunky Rice book instead. The day after Chunky Rice went to print, I started a new sketchbook and went back to blankets. And on that very first page of the sketchbook, there's like a scene of me burning my childhood art. And I think that's like a reoccurring theme in my creative struggle, is like this desire to destroy what I make. Like I feel like every day is that struggle. Like I just want to rip up the page I'm working on. And so I don't know, maybe I'm just really interested in that dynamic within myself between creativity and destructive urges, and I'm always fighting the destructive to make something constructive. And this is the first couple of pages from the sketchbook, which show some of my influences. There's a bunch of Bible verses there from Ecclesiastes, my favorite book of the Bible. I can't really read them right now, but then there's a quote from Swan's Way by Proust, which is a little bit of a pretentious influence and was definitely over my head at that time when I was 23 years old. Still would be over my head, but it definitely was probably the primary literary inspiration. So I always take from highbrow and lowbrow when I'm working. And then on that right hand page, there's some lyrics from a indie rock band. So I think it was a little bit Bible, Proust, and indie rock. That's what I was drawing from. And then here's more pages from the sketchbooks where like the scenes sort of emerge as if from a dream, and I just put them on paper. And strangely, they kind of are preserved in the final art that I draw years later. So those first like sort of visions that come to me end up in the book. And I have a lot of examples of these, like old sketchbook, final page of art. Entire scenes with my brother and I walking on icy snow. Kurt Cobain juxtaposed with Jesus on the walls of Raina's bedroom. And for people who haven't read the book, this is like about it's about sharing a bed with someone for the first time, which when I first set out to do the project, I thought it would be like a coming of age romance. But as I started meditating on my own experience, I realized like, oh, I shared a bed much earlier in a different context with my brother. And so then it became a lot about my family too, and the sibling dynamics. Here's more scenes that are the same in the sketchbook as they are in the final book. And at the point in my sketchbooks when I start drawing actual kind of comics breakdown pages, and especially when I start drawing outlines where I'm listing scenes, that means I'm ready to start writing the actual book, not just brainstorming. And when I write, I don't type out a script. Bless you. There are a lot of cartoonists that will type almost like a screenplay for their entire book before they start drawing. I'm always drawing and writing simultaneously. And I'll show some of that in a moment. This image is here. I did want to talk about the autobio element of the book. People are always asking, is everything in the book true? I was like, yes, it is, except the fiction is in the omissions. And the biggest omission is I have a sister who didn't make it into the book. And when I was starting to write the book in the thumbnail form, these are the thumbnails on the left. I did one panel with my sister, and then I hit like an instant creative block. Like I couldn't get further with what I was doing. And so I kind of realized like, oh, she's not part of the story that I'm meaning to tell. And at first I was trying to change more details than what happened in the end, but at first I was really trying to not make it look like our family. So taking my sister out made sense. On the right is a page from my newest project, Ginseng Roots, where I mend that issue. So my sister comes back in Ginseng Roots. The other major fictionalization or omission in Blankets is that I was homeschooled for the last year of my high school years, or senior year. My parents were really religious, and they just pulled us out for religious reasons to have a Bible-only education. And I started drawing, thumbnailing a few of those scenes too, and it wasn't like the book I was ready to tell. It was a book of its own, maybe eventually. So that I removed too from the book, these homeschool scenes. And like we grew up like in rural Wisconsin, a lot of Amish, Mennonite, German Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists. So the homeschool scene there was definitely like me as like a hippie, long-haired kid hanging out with boys in suspenders and girls in bonnets and floor-length dresses. So could be an interesting story to tell. I was really out of place in that scene. And these are some pages from the new project, Ginseng Roots, which if we have time, I'll talk about at the end here. So when I thumbnail a book, I just work on pieces of printer or typing paper. Where I work directly in ballpoint pen, and that's the stack of pages that then turned into blankets. I spent a year on that process alone. I wasn't working full time. I was an illustrator by trade, but it was a perfect job because I could. Half of my time was spent doing illustration gigs for magazines. A lot of those gigs have gone away now that print publication is not that big of a thing.
Rest in peace, Nickelodeon.
Yeah, you know it then, huh? Yeah, Nickelodeon was my main employer. Like I really lucked out once I landed that specific gig because I was struggling as an illustrator. It's like $50 here, $50 there. And then finally I landed a thing at Nickelodeon. If I did one page a month, I was set. And then the rest of the month I could work on my personal stuff. So, but it took a while to get to that good paying thing. So, and again, here on the right is the thumbnails where I kind of work out all the storytelling problems first. And then a year later, I start on the final art. And when I work on the final art, I can just focus on the drawing, making the drawing better. Because I've kind of worked out all the storytelling narrative problems in the thumbnail process. In some ways, it gets, I mean, like it's finished when I've done the thumbnails. Like I've kind of solved the narrative. But then I make a pretty version for the reader, basically. I'm not going to foist my looser drawings on people. There's thumbnails on the left and the final art on the right. And again, things stay pretty consistent. I have a lot of examples of these thumbnails compared to the final art. And in the new edition of blankets that we have today, this 20th anniversary edition, there's 40 pages of new material in the back that's like making of material. So some of this is in there, but I tried to bring stuff that's not in that edition too. And again, it's just a blue ballpoint pen. And then my final artwork is drawn with like a sable watercolor brush and indie ink on paper. Now that it's 2023, there is more computer involved in some of my production, but the final art is always on paper. It's always indie ink on paper and a brush, old slow media. I used to say that like basically what I do is kind of like cobblery. It's like an old-fashioned sort of medium that we're trying to keep alive, you know, like the sort of inkwell cartoonists. There's not a lot of us left that don't work digitally. I think I have anything specific to say about these. These are, again, more thumbnails. Sometimes I'll open up a layout. Sometimes a page of thumbnails will turn into 3 pages of final art or vice versa. Here you can see me like scribbling out text and rewriting text on that page. But overall, I'd say the compositions are fairly like consistent. I spent, let's see, the year 2000 basically working on the thumbnails, and then 2002 and 2003 doing or 2001 doing the final artwork. And this is actually very consistent with what I'm working on now. Like this, it all comes back to this sort of like theme of kind of my connection with my little brother. Here's the only page of pencils that I have preserved for the entire book. Usually I just pencil on the paper and then ink with a brush on top of that. In this case, I think I was trying to work out some problems, so I just had a piece of vellum that I was penciling on. And you can see like a little bit of the contrast from what I might pencil and what I might ink. One panel became more minimal rather than more detailed. And the other, I just tried to give it a little bit more dramatic angle, I think. So, and this is about the reception of the book 20 years ago. So that's kind of where everything changed, because up until that moment, I was not making any money doing comics or graphic novels. Again, I was lucky with the Nickelodeon gig. I was making money doing illustrations for kids magazines. But then everything changed with blankets and I got to tour the world. This is me next to Art Spiegelman of Mouse fame. And speaking of Mouse, I mean, and the way like graphic novels have changed so drastically. Probably the best graphic novel of all time is Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And that came out in the late 80s, early 90s. It was serialized. So it's a little different from what I did because he was serializing it in Raw magazine. And then he spent maybe, I think, 14 years on that project. And that was like early 90s that the kind of book market edition came out. And we were all like, oh, this is going to change everything, graphic novels. But it took another at least 20 years before any momentum gathered, because it takes a long time to make these books. So before Blankets, there was, I'll get to that in a moment. Before Blankets, there was Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan that came out in 2000. And then after Blankets, there was Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which came out in 2006. And I just lucked out because I was in the right moment in time between those two projects. And then I think the floodgates opened after that. But there really wasn't a graphic novel market before those books. I think there was some interest in it and a hunger for it. But again, because it takes so long and nobody was sitting around making 10-year projects. So when the book came out, this is me in high school with my dad. People ask this question, so I added these photos to the talk. It's like, well, how did your parents react to this book? And I have plenty of time for Q&A, but the book has a lot about my family being fundamentalist Christians and sort of my own relationship with their faith. And yeah, there's a lot of personal stuff in there about family dynamics. And so when it first came out, my dad was upset by like, what right do you have to make our private lives public? And what makes you think you're so special? Or what makes you think that your childhood was so difficult? And I was like, no, I actually don't think my childhood was that difficult. I think everybody's childhood is difficult. And the point for me of doing memoir, autobio stuff is I don't feel like it's an ego thing. I have argued this with other cartoonists because I had a cartoonist friend who said he's like, I'd like to do autobio work, but that seems like the easy route. I said, no, it's the other way around. Like if you can fiction, you can do whatever. But if you're like putting your own life on the line and it just opens up so many a can of worms of vulnerabilities and neuroses about how to present other people. For me, it's more challenging, but I really like reading autobio as a reader. And I think the comics and graphic novel medium is really well suited to that kind of vulnerable and intimate storytelling. So for me, that's the point. And what I told my dad is like, no, I don't think my childhood was difficult. I think when you tell these stories, you give the readers to kind of inhabit their own experiences. Like it conjures everybody's personal story. And that's been my experience being on book tours and stuff and hearing other people's, childhood connections. This is my mom and I in high school. That's the Welcome to Thompson High is when they pulled us out of. So I was like about a month into my senior year of high school. So, and then we just had like a purely Bible-based education from there on out. But my mom was upset by the book on a religious level. And she said I was using my talent for the devil. She said that I was going to hell. And I was like, well, that's okay because I don't believe in hell. And this upset them, but then they started kind of laughing too. They're like, well, if you don't believe in hell, you can't believe in heaven either. And I was like, yeah, I don't really believe in heaven either. And then my mom almost started crying. And she's like, well, if you don't believe in heaven, where is their hope? What is the point? Where's their hope? And that's the part of my parents that I feel just really deeply sympathetic towards, and just in general, like I might talk a little bit about that, but like like I know that especially for my mom, like there's a lot of solace in her faith, and so I never intended the book to be any kind of stance against their faith. I was kind of just expressing my own experience. And so, people look to different things for comfort in their lives. And that was a major theme of the book. And in the title, Blankets, what are these things that we look to for comfort and shelter, but also in sheltering, what are we covering up too? And then since Blankets came out, but especially in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been a subject of many book bans across the country. It's on the hot list, as a lot of graphic novels are. And so I recently, I get like every day almost, but certainly every week I get questions about, oh, will you talk to this newscaster or this school or something about the bans? And I usually don't answer. But I got contacted by Sandy Hook Elementary. And so, and it was a very it was an organizer from the library network there in Newtown, Connecticut. And it was a very, very sincere, invite. And I could tell that he had my back too. So I agreed to talk to them, and we did a Zoom talk with the community, because at that time they were pulling graphic novels off shelves throughout all of Newtown, Connecticut, including Sandy Hook Elementary. And yeah, so it was kind of as we got closer to the event, he's like, I'm not gonna let you talk to the audience because there's people that want to burn you alive here. He's like, it's a very, very violent situation. He's like, so we'll just keep it like, you'll see me on Zoom, and then that's, I'll ask you the questions. And he's like, if there's questions from the audience, they'll be funneled to the assistants, which will then be funneled through me. And so, yeah, so I had to kind of tackle the question of graphic novels in libraries and schools. And it's not something I have all the answers for, because again, when I made this book, I started Blankets when I was 23, and I was basically making it for other 20-something-year-old hipsters, that was the only market at that time, this very niche market within an already niche industry. And then graphic novels have changed that. It's made a much broader mainstream audience. It's given it critical attention, academic attention, which can work for and against the medium. And then also the question of censorship and who's the appropriate audience. And I don't have all the answers to those questions. I said, when I talked to them, I said, it's kind of up to the discretion of individuals and families. And Blankets is probably appropriate for most 16-year-old readers, and it might be appropriate for some 12-year-old readers, but I can't make that call, But I do think it's just important to not censor books, basically. So and the great irony. So at some point, though, during the talk, it was actually the final question. He asked me if there's any graphic novels that I'd read recently that I could recommend, and I was like, oh well, this book In Waves by A.J. Dungo. I don't know, is that available here? Maybe. It'd be an appropriate book for the Canada Beach Library because it also involves surfing. And it's about another memoir about a couple, and they both share surfing as their passion, and then she contracts bone cancer, and it traces. It has two parts. There's one is the history of surfing, and one is the history of their relationship. And they surf together, but then she loses a leg from bone cancer. She gets an artificial leg, and she still manages to at least ride waves in on her belly. And then she loses her other leg. She's in a wheelchair. She just still goes to the beach, every day with them, and just watches as they surf, and she can inhabit surfing. And then I said, spoiler alert, she dies, and then all that the author has for consolation is the ocean. That's all he does is surf. And even now, it makes me tear up. This is what happened when I talked about it, on this Zoom stage. where I just started tearing up. I'm like, geez, I'm like, this, I guess this really hit something to me. And I'm like, I lost someone to cancer too. And you don't get over those things. And I said, everyone here has lost someone to cancer or whatever, COVID now. And I said, it's amazing that something like graphic novels have the power to help you through that grief, to express that grief and share it. So, and then that was the last question, and then we ended the call. And as we ended it, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. There's people there from parents of Sandy Hook elementary students. I mean, this is 10 years after the tragedy, but and then I looked up some of the history, and like, yeah, of course, like there's tons of books that are banned in Sandy Hook, but they didn't get away with their assault rifle ban, so that never passed. Not to politicize things, but and one of the reasons I don't want to politicize is because like I also get attacked from the other side of the political spectrum, and I'm frustrated that right now like books seem to be like in this tug of war of the political and cultural divide of the U.S. And so I guess my defense of graphic novels is like, I don't know, are these a healthy thing for kids to read versus prose books? Hopefully it connects them with books in general and interacting with a medium that's a little more quiet and personal and, not digital. So I think graphic novels have been part of this conversation about keeping, books alive to some degree. And I want to make some time for Q&A now. But I guess the last thing I'll just say is like, I think with comics, and in the sort of like where we're at with our relationship to digital media, comics sort of like gets to the core of like a personal relationship with the author, because you can see the author's handwriting in what they draw. I mean, the text itself is hand lettered, at least in my work. And then the drawings too, you can see the expression of, it's like calligraphy from the author. I'm a huge fan of Peanuts, like everyone, and as Charles Schulz aged and his hand got shaky, I think most cartoonists, that's our favorite era of, even though Charles Schulz was frustrated, he was losing, the cleanness of his line. I think the more it became fragile, the more human it became. So with prose, I love prose, but you have a layer of arm's distance technology from the reader with typography. But with comics, you can still see that like handwriting on paper. So to me, it's like a letter to the readers. So that's, I think, where I'll leave things. I do have some examples of just some of the foreign editions of blankets. Is Pam mentioned it's been translated a lot. Also, I think it's easy to translate graphic novels. There's not as much text. I think foreign publishers can see a book and know that might be something they want. They can read part of it right away, whether they can read the text or not. And then, I did bring some images, right, for the new project, because the new project sort of stems out, I think, a little bit of the blankets. For years, people have been giving me pressure to do blankets too. And I've never wanted to repeat myself. I always want each project to be totally unique. But sort of the book I'm just finishing now, in spite of myself, has become blankets too. And it sort of started with the Taiwanese edition of blankets. They asked me to do a foreword, and I wrote this foreword about how basically like what an honor it was to be published in Chinese, and how the closest I ever got to China as a kid was working in ginseng fields. So in rural Wisconsin, it was like the leading producer of cultivated ginseng, American ginseng in the world, in my little hometown of 1,200 people. So I allude to it a little bit in blankets. I say that a country boy's summer is consumed by agricultural labor, which is entirely true. As a kid, I'd work 40 hours a week out in the fields. So this is that panel from blankets, and this is the new series, Ginseng Roots, picking rocks in a field. And so this new project, Ginseng Roots, and I know I'm here to promote blankets, but Ginseng Roots sort of like I started working on this book because I wanted to write about plants. I'd read Michael Pollan's Botany of Desire, and I'm like, oh, I want to do a book with plants as the protagonist rather than always a human-centric narrative. And what plant do I have the most intimate knowledge of? Oh, ginseng. And then the more I started meditating on that, I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird that I grew up harvesting this medicinal root that was all exported to China. Like my town was 1,200 people. It's just like all like kind of rural redneck types, but for a couple hundred years, very much interacting with Chinese trade. And really, ginseng is the beginning of the US's trade relationship with China. Oh, guys, everybody. And also my relationship to comics dates back to ginseng because again, working class family, there was no like allowance money for expendable income. It was working in the fields that my brother and I were able to earn the money to buy comic books, which really created the obsession and the dream of doing this for a living. So these are a few of the images from the new book. And as I was mentioning at the very beginning of all this, some of the fictions within blankets, removing my sister, I'm amending that with and addressing it with ginseng roots. And this has been a series. This is the first time I've worked in comic book form. When I did blankets 20 years ago, I was really sick of that format of the comic book. I found I associated it with superheroes and sort of a collector mentality. And a lot of the young sort of alternative cartoonists, as they were calling us, were wanted to legitimize the medium by making books with a spine. And again, this traces to that question of like, now that graphic novels is an actual market, like who is the audience? I mean, it's all ages, like you said. So you can't assume when you look at a graphic novel that's for kids or not. So this book is the first time I've worked in a serialized comic book form. And 2025, it's finished, the series is finished, but 2025 is when the final book will be out. And I don't remember what these images are for. I actually want to open up some time for Q&A because I'm kind of getting sick of my own voice. But this is just to show that a lot of those blanket themes start circling back. So 20 years later, I'm having this opportunity to sort of revisit some of those themes and put them in maybe a new context of my adult view of things, my adult relationship with my parents, with their church, with rural upbringing. Even Raina, the love interest, makes an appearance in the new book. And most of all, my relationship with my brother. And here we are still sharing a bed together. Here is, we traveled to like Northeast China, to rural China, where all the ginseng is grown, really off the beaten path. And, sharing beds along our journey. And yeah, so here we are in Korea, sleeping on the floor together. And that's my last image for this book. So I'd love to open up for some Q&A because you've all been really patient, and I like this intimate setting. It's a great time for.
It's been.
Yeah.
I don't happen to be a fan of graphic novels, but it's odd to me that there are people who apparently, from what you're saying, are against them and think that they're a bad thing. Why? What don't they like about them?
Well, Pam alluded to it too. Like, I think people still associate comics as a kid's medium, and graphic novels, well, at least when they started,
seemed like a reason to take them out of the school libraries.
Also, there's a thing, like the things that you can read in a prose book. If you then saw it like depicted visually, it could be more shocking. You could open up to a page. I've seen this with critiques of my work. Well, they'll take one panel out of context in a 600-page book to sum up a book. But it's like, well, that's one panel. It's like one frame in a movie to sum up a movie. That doesn't make any sense. I can think of books I've read. Wind Up Bird Chronicle comes to mind by Murakami,
Yes.
and how there's scenes in there I would hate to see visually represented, but I love the book, but it's like, I don't know if I'd want to see it. And you have to make certain decisions about you know. But I think the main thing is that it's still thought of as a kid's medium. And right now the graphic novel market is most thriving as a kid's medium. Which is the great irony, because I think like the graphic novel when it started was like, oh, here's a way to give it a little bit more legitimacy and create a adult readership for comics. But then as we've gone along the line, it's like the kids market is what's really taken off. And that's who's really obsessed with graphic novels. And that's the most thriving part of the graphic novel market too. So sometimes I think like just books like Blankets, which is sort of like you could say a gray area book. You know, I'd say it's appropriate for high school readers, but I don't, you know. I've met, you know, Hergé, the creator of Tintin, always said that his audience was ages 7 to 70. And I kind of,
What didn't you like about, why didn't people over 70 like them?
with what?
Why didn't people over 70 like them?
Or 9 to 90, whatever. Oh, yeah. Hergé, that's like, yeah, people did not live past 70, especially in France. No, I actually probably lived longer there. But yeah.
I take that question here.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here. Your books have been very important to me over the last couple of decades. I was living in Portland in 2010 and was working right next to the Powell's on Hawthorne, and started my collection of your books from that little shop. So thank you for that. I feel like the thing that makes graphic novels like really powerful for me is that combination of the prose and the imagery. You know, it's true in anything that you read, sometimes there's a phrase that just knocks your socks off. And then there's imagery that can say so much more than a phrase in so many other ways. And the marriage of the two is extremely powerful. And I think that that is why sometimes, with graphic novels, it can elicit so much emotion from people, because it's that marriage of the language and the imagery that can touch you in a very specific and unusual way, unexpected way. Which can lead to people feeling much more strongly about, that format than they might about other types.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot.
No, I love it. Yeah, you can write my Wikipedia page with Pam.
The thing that's been really resonant for me in your writing has been a very similar experience to your relationship with spirituality. And I grew up, mine was a Catholic story, but it was so devout growing up and felt like this had all the answers for me. And then growing up and realizing that the world wasn't really that simple, but still valuing that foundational thing in that experience, even though I found other ways of believing in the world around me. The question in there is, what is your relationship to spirituality now?
Oh, great question. I'm kind of obsessed with spirituality, I would say. And I would say that Christianity is still a huge part of my life, even though I don't identify as, quote unquote Christian. It's the framework within which I was raised. So it is kind of a lens that I look at a lot of things in the world. And I'm into Jesus, still like down with Jesus's teachings. And but for me, the message, and I guess that's part of the personal relationship part, is like the message of Jesus is not claiming his own divinity as much as, well, it is, but in a way that's very inclusive of all people. Like, to me, the message of I am the Son of God is not like I'm the only Son of God. I'm a child of God. And if you start recognizing all people as children of God, it removes some of these boundaries and separations we have with each other. You see the divine in everybody. what is love except seeing, the divine in other people. So
Yeah.
yeah.
When you have a translation made, how do you prove the language, whether they've got the spirit at least of your dialogue?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Some of the translations are like really meticulous where it takes a lot of my time and I'm going back and forth constantly with the translators. And it's exhausting sometimes. And they'll ask me some questions that seem really stupid to me. And I'm like, oh no, this can't be good. If they're that, but then they catch so many problems in my English, they'll be my best proofreaders actually with the English. And also with like just certain, with the ginseng book, they've been invaluable because I have 2 biologists proofreading in French. So I'm like, oh, I got that science wrong. I got to fix the science for the graphic novel edition. But then there's other editions that just get churned out overnight, and I'm sure they're terrible. I always say the success of the book in another country is all dependent on the translator, because in some places it's like huge, and then in other places it's and my biggest market internationally is India, and they're reading English edition there. Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up question to that one, because so much of what makes your book so unique is you have a like very specific lettering style that really evokes what you're trying to say emotionally. How does that work with translation? Are you working with other artists who letter in a similar style, or are you ever lettering the international versions of your books?
No, I've never done that. Most of them are done. They make a font out of my handwriting, but a few of my publishers, my German publisher, hand letters the books entirely in my style. My Korean publisher does the same, and that's especially cool to see like. But yeah, I think. Thanks for saying that. And I think for me as a reader, it's hard to look at digital fonts. So most graphic novels, they use a digital font, which is an eyesore. It's like Comic Sans, essentially. It's like it's hard to. That's why Mad Magazine used typography. That's maybe a little easier on the reader's eyes than some of this garish Comic Sans sort of font. But yeah, for me, it's all about the hand letters and keeping that intimacy in the handwritten thing. I can't imagine using type, but it does sometimes it makes editing annoying. Like, okay, I've spelled one thing wrong. I gotta go back. Yeah.
More questions? Oh, Doug?
How did or do your siblings react to your book?
Really good question. They're the biggest supporters. So
So you still talk to them?
yeah, I'm really close to my siblings. Yeah, I talk to my sister at least 3 times a week.
Oh, that's great.
My brother a little less often because he's a little more Midwestern, so he's not a man. He's a man of few words. But working, yeah, on specifically blankets and ginseng roots has brought me a lot closer to my siblings. I would say blankets got me closer to my brother, and ginseng roots has got me a lot closer to my sister. And for them, it's very meaningful. Yeah. So yeah, I feel really close to them, and I think we didn't grow up with a lot of like communication skills in our family. Again, Midwestern, stoic, types, not very communicative. So this was the only medium I had to express myself when I was younger. And hopefully I'm developing more verbal skills with age. But like the books themselves act as springboards to real life conversations. Wait, there's one in the back here. Yeah,
I was just wondering if you take ginseng.
You know what? I was just talking with the naturopath 2 days ago, and he said, he's like, I think I have to put you on some ginseng. I was like, that would be poetically perfect. Why do you ask? Are you in Chinese medicine world?
I grew up playing, but after reading I read the first 5, and I was like, I want to try to grow ginseng here. It's so complicated. So
A lot of moisture out here.
yeah,
But there is
it's a powerful plant.
Yeah.
There's a reason that.
And Oregon is one of the, producers of cultivated ginseng. Strangely, not on the level of Wisconsin, but yeah, we're on the same 45th parallel. I don't know if you've been reading the series, so maybe that's a reason, because like Jilin province of China is also on the 45th parallel. Bordeaux region of France is 45th parallel. So there's something to do with the growing in Tahoe, whatever, all these places. So
Earlier, you mentioned something about putting prose into graphic form. And I got to thinking about the classic comics. You remember classic comics?
yeah,
Do they have, because, you know, they would take like a Monte Cristo and
Yeah.
put it into graphic form. Was that something ever in your life or?
no, I've never. Oh, yeah, I read those, some of those, yeah, but they're all pretty
But they
cheesy.
were just. They still just like the comics. Comics.
Yeah. And they would take Moby Dick and just turn it into like
Right.
a superhero adventure story. Yeah, basically. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it done successfully. Other than there's an adaptation of Paul Auster's City of Glass. So that's a short novella, and it's, you know, kind of metaphysical noir. So that adaptation, I've heard, I've never read the prose version, but the adaptation is amazing, and I've heard it's better in a way. And I think Paul Auster actually helped collaborate with that too. There's a lot of trendy ones these days, you know, Margaret Atwood and people like that have, a lot of authors are now jumping over into graphic novel adaptations. For mine, I don't know, I can't think of any ones that I really enjoy.
I didn't read them either, but they were out there.
Yeah. There are occasionally books I read, like say Bulgakov, Master and Margarita, where I'm like, I want to see, do you know that book? I'm like, I want to see the graphic novel adaptation of this, because it is a very visual book, you know, and it's so dense with so many things. I think if some of it was drawn, it would give you more space to get into like the ideas behind those visuals. I don't know.
Oh, Chinking All Stars.
Yeah.
Would be-
Yeah. So there are books that you
Yeah.
read sometimes like this would be, there was a Saul Bellows book that I was like, this would be a cool graphic. Surrealistic books, I guess, a lot of times. Yeah.
Am I correct in remembering that you moved back to the Midwest when you were like in the middle of printing roots?
Yeah.
How did that compare to like working on blankets in Portland, remembering your time growing up in Wisconsin versus actually being in that space, drawing those spaces?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it didn't make that much of a difference. I mean, I moved a lot during pandemic. When pandemic started and I was kind of stuck in isolation in Portland, my brother had invited me like a year earlier to live with him in Minneapolis. So I finally took him up on the offer in summer of 2020. And that was really awesome to be there. And then, you know, the next year I went to LA for a winter because I didn't think I could do a winter in Minneapolis. But then I decided to try Minneapolis again. I went back there another summer in 2021, and I was convinced I didn't know how to end the series. Oh, that's the thing I didn't talk about in this presentation is that the way I work is I never know the ending of my books, which is not the best way to work. I feel like most authors say they work the opposite, like they have to know the ending and then they kind of work backwards. But
That's why they're so long.
that's part of the reason I'm long, is I'm just like getting lost in a labyrinth searching for that exit, you know. And the exit is usually the moment where I can pass the baton off to the reader. It's like that right moment where I don't think you ever finish a book. You know, you don't finish the race. You just pass it on for reader participation. And you know, there's something that Craig was saying that was like, you know, like people project a lot of things onto the stories, but that's part of the point. That's the point of stories. It's like they're in dialogue, in conversation with the person reading them, and they mean something different to you at different times in your life. You know, it's weird for me to look back on a book I did 20 years ago and not really recognize the author as a totally different person. So yeah, the end of a book is really just the moment where it's like, okay, now it's the reader's turn to engage a story and create whatever life it has.
Are you a Midwesterner or a West Coaster?
I would say I'm probably more, no, I'm both. When I was in Minneapolis, I felt very West Coast. But Minneapolis is a little different from Wisconsin. But they're very, like, they're more, I don't know if cold is the term. I think West Coasters would kind of like wear everything on our sleeve. We're really, yeah, and we're kind of woo-woo, so we're really open to all kinds of different forms of
You'd be having a
expression.
totally different conversation if you were in Minneapolis.
Yeah. Minneapolis, I'm just too out there, and just they don't know how to handle it. Thanks again for being here. But then for a long time I felt very Midwestern because I thought like I had a weird obsessive work ethic that I got from the Midwest, where everybody in Portland seemed like they were more laid back and not working as hard. So I think early in my career that work ethic served me for sure. So probably a little bit of both, but I never felt like I belonged growing up. And that's a major theme of most of my works too. It's like just searching for a place to belong. And the books themselves, like the opportunities to travel the world and make connections with readers, that really extends this feeling of belonging, on a global scale, which is another big theme of most of my books too, about the artificiality of the boundaries.
Yeah.
You had a question?
So I'm curious about the issue of plagiarism when you would take almost specifically something from the French and then, I mean, I don't
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's plagiarism, but I'm just curious what you might want to say about it. And
Oh, yeah.
how you can just take something so directly.
Well, I was young, yeah. Those are the scenes that I was able to track down, and it was that afterthought. It wasn't a conscious thing.
Yeah.
Like years later, looking at those, poring over those
Oh,
books
so
again, I'm like,
no one's ever come
whoa.
up and said, you can't do that.
No, I'm the one that made that. I'm the one outing it. Yeah. So, and I think that happens a lot with young artists, is you just wear your influences on your sleeve. I mean, there's certainly a lot of blankets ripoffs, out there, and it's
Yeah, some out
flattery,
of
right, to be
respect and
imitated.
some out of just knowing it so well that it's just in your unconscious how you
Yeah.
do it. So I was just curious.
Almost goes along with it, the cure lyrics that you have in
Oh, yeah.
blankets. Was there any issues clearing that? Were there any other bands that you're
We just
listening
put it in the addition. We just cited Robert Smith as so I think legally that's all we had to do with like a tiny excerpt of music lyrics. This new project I'm doing is journalistic, so all of the dialogue is coming from recordings. And it's been very nerve-wracking because like I don't know how journalists do it. Actually, I know journalists don't always do it in the most ethical way. Basically, I'll make hundreds of pages, or I should say many hours of recordings that then I transcribe into hundreds of pages of interviews, and then I'll just lift little bits out here and there for the dialogue in the scenes. So it's all from recordings, but then I have to send it to the person I interviewed for their approval once I've drawn pages. It's super nerve-wracking because I'm like, if they don't like this, I just wasted years, so I've been trying to be very ethical about that, in contrast to, I think, a lot of journalists that I've been interviewed by, where I'll see stuff in print where I'm like, I didn't say that. Or if I did, there's just lots of misinformation in the media. Actually doing a documentary work made me start to believe that, all news is fake. And I'm using a little, but I learned that documentary is like the most contrived of mediums, basically. Because when you're taking reality and then trying to shape it into something like a narrative or something digestible or short or small, it's like all about editing. And editing is a form of fictionalization, so there is no truth in that sense in storytelling, But to curb that, I just try to send everything to people I've interviewed to get their approval. It's been pretty good so far on the Ginseng Woods project. But I never contacted Robert Smith, so.
The insight you had as a 23-year-old in thinking about what was really a recent history, I thought was just really amazing, in terms of looking at the relationship with Raina and her family dynamics and situation, and to understand. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm dissing 23-year-olds, but I thought that was really remarkable, and the kindness that you had for all of the people, all of the characters you created. It was really beautiful.
Thank you. I think all the books are very much like timestamps or bookmarks on that moment in my life. I couldn't make a book like Blankets now that I'm almost 50. It would be almost creepy. Make a book meditating on a high school love, but at that time it was quite fresh, it's only 4 years after that relationship, and at the time I felt like I'd never be in love again, so I was channeling that into the book, so that was the right time to make that book. It was fresh then, and I was struggling with those things in the book in real time, and that's, I guess, what the new book is too, real time struggle.
Any more questions? Anybody online, Jen?
And I don't have, yeah, we had people online, but nobody has asked
No-
any questions.
Okay. I think another question here and then we'll probably
Yeah,
wind this
let's
up.
create just-
I just have one thing that, I guess I need to ask. How much of a Christian viewpoint is there in your novel?
In blankets.
In Blanket?
Well, based on what I was saying earlier, I would say very Christian in my view of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, if that makes sense. But my parents are much more are fundamentalists than me, you know, and so we have different relationship with, you know, with their faith, basically. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer specifically because it's very kind of a fluid, organic, dynamic that's always happening. Yeah, does that answer your question? Though I'm not sure if I can
Like,
fully.
talk about the Bible, about Jesus, about. You have
There's a lot of
quotes.
Bible verses in the book. So speaking of plagiarism.
Okay.
And Habibi, for that matter, is in dialogue with the Quran. So like when Habibi, I started after 9/11, and I realized I had basically no understanding of Islam, so I started reading the Quran during that time, and learned very quickly, like, oh, this is kind of the same things I grew up in, and people who grew up in this faith have almost the same experiences as me. We had the same stories we grew up with, all the same prophet, a lot of the same prophets. One of them's different, I guess. And moral system, and whether you were like a casual Muslim or Christian versus, a more fundamentalist, a lot of similarities. It was more about similarities, and so that's what I focused on in that book. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Where do we buy the books?
Right over here.
Nice stack of them. Yeah, and this edition just came out like a month or so ago, and it's got that whole like new stuff in the back that has never existed before.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. Well, thank
Thank
you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's gonna be terrible if I was to sign it for you.
No,
I have.